Have our fascinating tales of everyday people from the past inspired you to explore your own family story? This episode is brought to you by findmypast.co.uk, the perfect place to start building your family tree for free. It makes it so easy to get started with just a few details and helps you fill in the gaps from there. Their smart hints do the hard work for you, instantly unearthing clues to your past from their vast record collections. You can search other members' family trees to make new connections and even share your discoveries with loved ones as your family tree grows. In just a few minutes, you'll have a flourishing family tree full of incredible stories and revelations. Visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime to start your family tree with a free trial. That's findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime. Free trial auto renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And last week, Sarah, we were exploring the story of two Shakespearean actors, the British actor William Macready and the American Edwin Forrest, and how their personal rivalry became to be drawn into a much bigger 19th century culture war in the United States that was over class and immigration, national identity, religion, and anti-British sentiments. But those forces explode into deadly violence in May 1849 at the Astor Place Opera House, which was a New York theater built by the city's elite for the express purpose of excluding the city's working class. And the series of events that lead to that violence, the Astor Place Riots, they begin on the 7th of May, 1849.
That's right, David. So as we said last time, at this point, New York is really a powder keg. And the English aristocrat Macready is ready for his opening night in New York. He's going to play Macbeth. And at the same time, the flag-waving American Ned Forrest is also going to play Macbeth on the same night, a few blocks away at the Broadway Theater.
And this is not a coincidence. This is not two accidental bookings of plays that happen to be nearby. This is entirely deliberate.
Indeed. Forrest had been doing this for a while. He had been kind of shadowing Macready around America, booking different theaters in the same city on the same night to play the same part and to go head to head with him. And so Forrest has really set this up. Now, you would expect most of Forrest fans to go watch Forrest and Macready's fans to watch Macready. And as you said, the Astor Place Opera House, as we were talking about last time, was set out to exclude the working class fans of Forrest. But in fact, what happened on this night, on May 7th, on Macready's opening night, is that dozens of Forrest's fans, the American populace, we were saying kind of a MAGA crowd fans, actually got seats at the Astor Place Opera House for Macready's performance. And they got these tickets probably thanks to Tammany Hall operatives giving out free tickets. So basically, Forrest's side buys up tickets at the Astor Place Opera House and hands them out to Forrest supporters and tells them to come to watch the hated Macready.
And we're using the words supporters and fans because this is an age in which people support actors as if they were sports teams or if they were kind of star strikers or key basketball players, that these people love these actors and they use them as a kind of vehicle for their passions, their kind of hatred of the British or their kind of class enmity towards the rich.
Yeah. So there are these really strong tribal loyalties that are feeding all of this. And so Forrest supporters come into Macready's show ready to sabotage the performance. And they do that from the beginning. So as we were saying last time, if audiences didn't like a performer in 19th century America, they made a lot of noise. And that is exactly what starts to happen to Macready. There's boos, jeers, stamping, shouting, hissing, and they start cheering for Forrest as Macready is trying to play Macbeth. So they're shouting 3 cheers for Ned Forrest, even though Forrest is a few blocks away playing Macbeth in a different theater. People kept a kind of shopping list of what was thrown at Macready and the other performers. They threw rotten eggs. They threw apples, potatoes, pennies, old shoes that they had brought with them. And then they started tearing up the theater seats and they started hurling theater seats at the stage, while they were also hurling insults like English hog and probably, worse imprecations than that.
I love 19th century insults, you English hog.
English hog.
I could live with that.
There was so much noise that Macready signaled to his fellow actors. He didn't want to back down, but there was so much noise they couldn't actually be heard. And so they started playing in pantomime. They just were doing it in dumb show, as it was called at the time.
So they weren't speaking the lines?
They weren't speaking the lines because they couldn't be heard over the noise.
So they were just doing the gestures.
And then a vial of, it's actually a spice called asafoetida, was thrown onto the stage. And in its raw form, asafoetida, the word fetid is in the middle of it for a reason. I've thankfully never smelled it, but it is described as smelling like a mix of rotting garlic, sulfur, and sewage. And at the time, the nickname for it was devil's dung. It's so pungent and noxious. So in a small confined space like a theater, it would have just driven everybody out, gasping for air. So this is the kind of conditions that Macready is trying to power through Macbeth under. But eventually they couldn't do it. And Macready actually gives up. They abandon the performance and Macready flees the theater.
So the supporters of Edwin Forrest have won. They've done what they set out to do. They have driven this English actor off the stage of this elite theatre that they resent. They've had a victory.
Yes, they've driven him off the stage, out of the theatre. And so, of course, there's a celebration in the street. There's cheers and catcalls and noises in the street. And meanwhile, a few blocks away, as Forrest is performing Macbeth, the crowd is ecstatically supporting him. And when Forrest delivers Macbeth's line, "What purgative drug will scour these English hence?" the audience erupts in approval. So simultaneously, Macready is driven off and Forrest is given a hero's, welcome, and everybody is loving his performance. Now, after driving Macready off the stage, Forrest's supporters that night on May 7th, 1849, they weren't done yet. His supporters weren't just anti-elitist, and we alluded to this last week. They were, as we said, also anti-immigrant. They were also anti-Black, and they were anti-abolition. And the same night, Forrest supporters boo Macready off the stage, and then the next thing that they did was they went on to break up an anti-slavery meeting. So they knew one was happening, and they went and they broke it up. So the important thing to note here is that for them, Macready isn't just representing aristocratic exclusion and elitism. He also stood for progressive politics and racial tolerance. He was himself a Republican. He was anti-monarchist and he was sympathetic to reform. And so for anybody who knew his politics, which of course is, out in the press at the time, this would have only inflamed Forrest supporters more against him.
The context here, of course, is that Britain had ended the slave trade in 1807 and ended slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s. And of course, America was still a slave-owning state. There are now, by this point, millions of enslaved people in the United States. And part of the rivalry, part of the enmity between Britain and America is over this issue of slavery. So a British actor being on stage performing Shakespeare is drawn into this dispute over slavery and what it says about these two nations.
That's exactly right. And a lot of Americans deeply resented British people telling them what to do about slavery. We talked about this in our episode on the Great Exhibition because the same antagonism is present. Of course, that's only 2 years later. And even if they weren't pro-slavery themselves, they kind of resented British people telling them what to do. So absolutely, that plays into the mix. So Macready is driven off the stage on May 7th. Understandably, he wants no part of this anymore. I mean, he's having sheep's carcasses thrown at him. So he decides he's giving up and he's going to return to England.
Yeah, he vows never to come back to America. This is, why go through this? Understandably, he's had enough.
This is understandable. So he think, this country is full of yahoos and, yokels and I want no part of it and I'm leaving.
That should have been the end of the story. And if it had been, then this would be a sort of an anecdote from the history of American theatre. But he doesn't leave.
But actually what happened was an intervention from New York City's elite. So the people who had brought Macready over wanted him to play at the Astor Place Opera House. They were furious. They were embarrassed. Of course, it makes America look very bad. They don't want to be associated with people throwing sheep's carcasses. That was the whole point of building the Astor Place Opera House in the first place. And so they wrote a public letter signed by 47 prominent men. And of course, it would be all men. Now, these are mostly forgotten names today, but there are a few names that people will recognize, notably the writer Herman Melville, who, of course, is the author of Moby Dick, and also the writer Washington Irving, who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. So a couple of very, canonical American writers are part of this group of Americans begging Macready to stay. They frame it as a stand for civilization. Like, this is against mob rule. We should not be allowing the mob to dictate our entertainment, our choices, and we stand against chaos. So you need to hold the line. We're going to hold the line. It's not going to happen again. You need to come and continue your performances. And so Macready agrees.
But here, these 47 elite men are also challenging what theatre, the role theatre performs in American life. Because to say you're against mob rule, you're against chaos, is also to say the theatre, in their view, should not be what it traditionally has been, as a place where people can express their feelings and their opposition, their frustrations and their angers. So this is a deep cultural division over the function of the theatre.
Yeah, and it's moving in the direction of a theater that we would recognize, a more respectful, a more decorous crowd that is deferential to the performers and has those elitist associations. So yeah, so they draw a line in the sand and they say, you've got to stick with our side and, man up, pull up your socks and do it again. Or I guess pull up your hose, your doublet.
And it's quite flattering for Macready. He's just had this awful experience, but these very wealthy elite people say, no, you matter. You must stay. Shakespeare matters. English actors being able to come to America matters. And they're sort of asking him, saying, hey, you got supporters here. We'll protect you. We'll make this work.
Yeah, so he feels flattered, and so he decides that he's going to try it again on May 10th. So they agree the next performance will take place on May 10th.
And that's the fatal decision, really, to say, all the warnings had taken place on the 7th.
Yeah.
That performance had gone really badly wrong in every way it could, but there hadn't really been much violence in the theatre.
Yeah. That's not going to be the case on May 10th. So they decide that they're going to try it again. And when news of that gets out, another campaign begins. So there are the elite supporters of Macready, but downtown, people are not taking this lying down. So Forrest supporters, with the backing of Tammany Hall operatives, start posting handbills.
So little posters.
Yeah, little posters that are all over town on lampposts, on, barroom doors, on church doors. And these are the handbills that you read from, David, at the beginning of our story last week, that demanded in all capital letters, working men, shall Americans or English rule in this city? So they're making it, a stark divide. They're saying the English are trying to take over. And you have to stand up for American rule in New York City. And they urge their followers or anybody who thinks the English shouldn't rule New York to descend upon the English aristocratic opera house. That's what they call it. So they make it explicitly about democratic rights and privileges, about American democracy. And they basically are waving flags saying, if you believe in American democracy, you need to go to the Astor Place aristocratic opera house tonight and stop the British aristocracy from taking over New York. That's how they frame it.
They cover their back a tiny bit by saying we're not advocating violence, but then they make up a story saying that there's an English steamship in the harbor that has all of these kind of dark plans for America. It's a little bit half-hearted there. We're not suggesting violence, but we are suggesting you go down there in mass and stop a performance. So it's a kind of legal disclaimer, but not much more.
It's plausible deniability, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm afraid it does remind me of Donald Trump, calling on, I think it was the Proud Boys, wasn't it? But anyway, one of the militia groups to stand by, right? So it's trying to pretend that you're not calling for exactly what you are calling for. So the subtext would have been clear. And indeed, it was clear because it was clear to the authorities as well, who responded in kind. Now, we know that the organizers included party boss operatives from Tammany Hall. It included hardline nativists who were furious at the idea of British taking over of New York or any foreign interference in New York, really. And together they are distributing these handbills. They're distributing tickets for the performances. They're fanning the flames of class grievance and resentment, and they mobilize thousands. So this is no spontaneous protest. That's a really important part about the riot. It has been mobilized by these forces downtown.
And they're trying to build these tensions in a city of immigrants, a city of division, a city of the rich and the poor, with a growing inequality between the two, but also a city full of young men. I mean, one of the things about cities full of immigrants is immigrants tend to be young men. It's a city of street gangs. There's no shortage of people who, doesn't take much for them to be up for a bit of a brawl.
Especially the Bowery Boys, right? Who, as we said last time, are these kinds of gangs of street toughs who are roaming the downtown area and are the muscle of Tammany Hall. And they're usually spoiling for a fight. They're looking for a fight in general. And tonight, on May 10th, 1849, they're really looking for a fight. So this is what happens. So dusk falls on May 10th, 1849. Everyone is waiting for the curtain to go up. But the curtain is not just going to go up on performances of Macbeth. It's going to go up on deadly violence.
So the elite are putting on their tuxedos and they're putting on their kidskin gloves and shaving and all of the dress restrictions, the dress codes that they have to do to get into the Astor Place Theatre. And at the same time, the Bowery Boys and the supporters of Edwin Forrest are getting ready for a very different sort of evening.
Yeah, they're gathering outside. And Astor Place, which is a small little area, it swells with up to, estimates are as many as 10,000 people. There's a huge number of people. So incredibly combustible conditions. And they are crammed. They're on rooftops. They're hanging off of lampposts. They're squeezed onto window ledges. People are also coming to watch what's going to happen. They're spectators. It's like a spectator sport. They know something's going to happen, but they don't know what. Now, most of these people are Forrest loyalists. They've been mobilized by Tammany Hall. They are not armed with weapons. That's one of the differences between the U.S. in 1849 and today. People might think that in the 19th century, Americans would all be carrying guns, but as a matter of fact, that is not how America was. New York City was not like that. They are armed only with bricks and stones that they've gathered from, kind of construction sites around or wherever they could get them. And also they are armed with their really, really bitter anger. But there are also a lot of people who are just innocently passing by or just come to watch the show, maybe foolishly, but they are also, they're not necessarily partisan and they are there because everybody knows something is about to happen.
And many of these supporters of Edwin Forrest, people had bought tickets for them. So the aim is to also get some of the people who are opposed to Macready who want to stop this show inside the theatre, not just outside.
Yeah. So they're going to try again to do what they did on May 7th, to drive him off the stage with as many supporters as they can. But this time it was much harder. So the authorities are prepared. The theater was prepared. So they had police mustered outside. Unsurprisingly, there are about 100 police outside, but there are 150 policemen inside the theater as well. And as a precaution, the mayor has called out the New York State militia. So this is not a full-time military. This isn't a professional army. This is part-time volunteer militia, but it's 350 men who are armed, they're uniformed, and they're mounted. There's a cavalry there as well. And they are posted nearby in Washington Square, where there is infantry mustering, and they are there in case something kicks off. And Macready returns to the stage. This time he's under armed guard, and this time, Forrest supporters had found it harder to get into the theater. They tightened security. They managed to keep a lot of them out. So fewer than 100 protesters have made it in. So this time, they're quite outnumbered. So Macready steps onto the stage, and the same sabotage begins again. Boos, jeers, hissing, stamping feet. And they're shouting out with him, and they're trying to drive him off the stage. But what really matters on May 10th is what starts happening outside the theater, because a siege begins, really. And Forrest supporters armed with these rocks, with these bricks, with cobblestones. They start hurling them at the theater and they start smashing windows. And so these rocks start getting hurled into the theater from outside. A brick comes sailing through and hits the theater chandelier. Forest supporters try to set fire to the theater with everybody inside it. They actually try to light it afire inside and out. And the rioters try to break down the doors. So violence is immediate. The handbills might have said we're not advocating violence, but they start assaulting not people, but the hated theater itself, the symbol of all of this bitter resentment.
And there's a terrible coincidence here because there's work being done nearby on the New York sewerage system, which means that the road had been dug up. There's a huge pile of cobblestones. So, as you said, Edwin Forrest supporters had arrived unarmed, but suddenly here's a great big pile of cobblestones. So they have the weapon at hand to start bombarding. And bombarding is not an inaccurate word, I think, here. Bombarding this theatre, throwing bricks, throwing these cobblestones through the windows, crashing down onto the spectators, into the audience.
I think that's right. And it's not hyperbole. The New York Tribune reported afterwards that the Opera House resembled a fortress besieged by an invading army. So they were using that language as well. The people, the eyewitnesses, that is how they saw it. And look, if you're sitting in a theater and a brick starts, is hurled through and hits the chandelier, you would feel under siege as well.
I mean, there's no question a cobblestone thrown through the air could kill you.
Yeah. It's a hail of cobblestones, a hail of rocks. And as we're saying, also bricks. And they're trying to set fire to the place. I mean, the violence is very real. Macready is powering through, though. He is determined that he is going to get to the end of this performance. He is not going to be booed off the stage the way that he was on May 7th. His fellow actors plead with him to call it off. The bricks hailing at them. And he says, no, they're going to keep going. So he performs Macbeth through crashing glass. And of course, as the windows break, they can hear the noise of the crowd outside. So there's this growing roar from outside, and he keeps going. And he delivers some of Macbeth's martial lines, like, I will not be afraid of death and bane, with this kind of great defiance.
There are reports that said this was one of his best performances of Macbeth, which, given the circumstances, is quite astonishing. I mean, he is quite clearly, having been driven off the stage 3 days earlier, he is quite determined to stand up to this abuse.
Yeah. If he's a great actor, you can see why it would kind of, bring the best out of you. And look, Macbeth is the right part for these kinds of conditions, I guess. I mean, if he'd been playing a comedy, it would have been a lot harder, or even Hamlet. But Macbeth
Twelfth Night wouldn't have been a good play for that evening. Yeah.
But exactly. I mean, he certainly deserves a great deal of credit, of personal credit, for courage and for determination. And he pushes through, and the play, almost miraculously under those conditions, they managed to finish the performance, and they go all the way to the end of the play. Maybe they cut a little bit as they were going. History does not record. Maybe they accelerated a bit towards the end. But the curtain falls, and the audience is escorted outside under bayonets. So far, the damage has only been to property, to the theater itself. But the anger is not subsiding. So outside, there are cries of burn the damned den of the aristocracy and America rules England tonight. So you can hear the nationalism, the patriotism, is jingoism, right? But also this idea that we were talking last time about how anti-British sentiment was partly tied into a lingering fear or conspiracy theory that the British were trying to reclaim the United States. And so a line like America rules England tonight is loaded with all of those associations about democracy, the revolution, we're in charge, it's our country, not yours. And amidst all of this anger, the cavalry and the infantry who are nearby in Washington Square, they start to move toward the theater. They push forward to try to carve a path through the mob.
Macready survives. He gets off stage. What happens to him?
He actually had to escape the theater in disguise. So we found another costume or something, and they disguise him. And then obviously with some armed escort, he manages to escape out of the theater and then hightails it out of the city.
Because he's in real danger.
He's in real danger. And actually, at that point, rumors start to go through the crowd that he's left. And according to some reports, that did diffuse a little bit of the crowd's anger, that they had managed to get rid of him, that he's gone. But it didn't diffuse it enough. And so as the crowd's rage is still kind of, unsatisfied, the militia that has been waiting in Washington Square starts to move forward because the crowd is no less violent and the tensions are still high. And so the cavalry units push through first, and they're trying to carve a path through the mob just to push them away. But the mob are still armed with these bricks and cobblestones and sticks, whatever else they had, and they start hurling them at the cavalry. Some of the mounted officers were actually pulled from their horses, and they're, getting hit with these bricks and cobblestones. And so the cavalry actually falls back, and the mayor was there, the new mayor, who was opposed to Tammany Hall, and he's informed that the militia is outnumbered, and he's told he needs to make a decision about whether the militia should fire on the crowd. And he scarpers. He scuttles off and he goes and hides in a hotel and leaves other people to make I was going to say fateful decision, but as it turns out, it is also a fatal decision.
And this mayor, Caleb Woodhull, this is his second day in office.
Yeah, he's not exactly covering himself in glory, is he? We've had some of our less impressive figures. We're not fans of Robert Knox on this show. I think we can also say that this mayor, the mayors of New York actually have a lot to answer for in history. That could be another episode that we do. So there was an order that was given. People have argued about where the order came from. But basically what happens is the militia is ordered to charge with bayonets. So we're still in infantry at this point. The rioters grab the muskets from the militia. And at that point, someone gives the order for the cavalry and the infantry to fire, but to fire over the crowd's heads. So they kind of give a warning shot. So there's a volley across everybody's head, and the crowd starts jeering and shouting, and they return to the attack. So they start flinging stones again at the militia.
When the militia fire over the heads of the crowd, there is also this rumor at that moment that they are firing blanks, that they don't have any musket balls. And that emboldens the crowd even more. They convince themselves that they're not in the danger that they really are in.
The degree to which kind of rumor and conspiracy is an active participant in this story is really important to understand. And that is one of the key moments. Exactly. So these people are under the impression that the soldiers are firing blanks. And so they think that they're safe, and they're not. So there was a second order then to fire, but this time to shoot low. So again, most of the crowd believes that blanks are being fired. Some retreat, but then the huge crowd of 10,000 strong surges forward. And at this point, the militia opens fire. They open fire directly into the crowd. And suddenly the rioters discover that they are not firing blanks because they are stumbling over corpses in the street next to them. And at this point, panic erupts.
Throughout this, a kind of storm of cobblestones is being thrown at the militia, and the officers in charge genuinely think that there is a risk that they will be killed, that people could be stoned to death. So this decision to fire is in some ways reflective of the level of violence and how the situation has spun out of control. That attempt to try to fire over people's heads was, I guess, in some ways the last hope of preventing an outbreak of even worse violence.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they did try. You have to acknowledge that they tried, but they felt like it was their last resort. And as we'll see in the aftermath, people debate over, whether they made the right decision or not. An angry crowd of 10,000 strong hurling bricks and trying to set fire to a theater is a formidable thing to face, but it is civilians and they are unarmed, and the militia fires into the crowd. And at that point, there's a stampede, panic, chaos. Of course, people running in every direction, and the militia keeps firing for a while. And by midnight, more militia units have arrived. And in fact, they bring artillery support in the form of small cannon. They actually roll cannons through New York City, and they're positioned on Broadway and in the Bowery. So they brought out cannons against New York civilians. And that gives us, I think, again, as you're saying, a sense of the stakes, of the real danger and of the escalation of the violence. But the cannons, luckily, were not fired, but they're there, obviously, in part to frighten off the mob. And by 1 a.m., the crowd had dispersed, but they left behind what looked like a battlefield. It was a scene of absolute carnage. Astor Place was wrecked. There were bullet holes, shattered windows, smashed doors. There were pools of blood on the sidewalk. There was, iron railings were torn loose. They had been used as weapons. The riot is finally ending, saying there's kind of the sun rises on the scene of carnage, but people are still dying. The streets are strewn with bodies. So some dead, many other dying, others, wounded, bleeding, dazed. And the opera house itself, the Astor Place Opera House, became a kind of field hospital. And it became a morgue. They carried the wounded and the dying into the Astor Place Theater.
Some of the wounded are taken to local hospitals where they die. One man dies on the snooker table, the billiards table in a local tavern.
Yeah. There was a 17-year-old Irish, I would call him a boy because a 17-year-old is a boy to me, a 17-year-old Irish oyster vendor. He was selling his oysters and he was killed with a bullet through the heart. There was a 30-year-old Irish woman who was just out buying shirts with her husband. They were innocent passersby. She was shot in the leg, but her leg then had to be amputated as they tried to save her, and it was no good. And she died a few days later from her wounds. So like that poor Irish woman, many of the victims of the Astor Place riots were not actually rioters. They were passersby. They were local residents. They were children. There was a child who was trampled underfoot. There was a tailor just watching from his doorstep and he was struck in the neck and killed. So people who were just shot while they were heading home or while they were looking on.
We'll take a break there and come back to survey the aftermath of the Astor Place riot, but also its consequences. Welcome back. Sarah, can you describe the scene on the morning after the riot, the 11th of May, 1849?
Well, as we said, David, it's carnage in the streets of New York. There were between 22 and 31 dead after the riots. Now, the reason we don't know the exact number is because, as we were saying before the break, the bodies were being carried off in the midst of all of this mayhem. They were taken, as you said, to saloons, laid out on pool tables. They were carried to butcher shops, private homes. So it was actually impossible to tally the exact numbers. 48 civilians were wounded, over 50 police were injured, and over 141 militia were struck by these projectiles that were being hurled. At least 7 of the dead were Irish immigrants. They were almost all working class. But of course, certainly some of the people injured were probably rioters, but there were way too many who were simply in the wrong place. Bellevue Hospital filled to capacity, people with, broken bones and concussions and bullet wounds, and arrests continue as you might expect. So over 80 people were detained over the following hours, mostly for resisting or loitering, not for any real physical resistance.
You would think that the people at the heart of the riot by this point had got themselves off the streets. So I think lots of, again, people in the wrong place at the wrong time amongst those arrested.
Yeah, most likely. But of course, the real reckoning at this point is not about arrests, but about the militia's decision to fire into an unarmed crowd. Whether they're armed or not armed is a matter of a little bit of debate. But they did not face gunfire, and they fired into the crowd. But there was very little condemnation of their actions. Most of the press and certainly the city's elite supported that decision. They felt that it was an appropriate and proportionate response to the violence in the streets. And the newspapers raced to respond. They were, of course, polarized. This is a deeply partisan story, as we've been saying. So the Evening Post defended the militia, blaming a foreign mob, and said that the militia was, acting appropriately. But the Tribune called it military murder and asked how a theater could turn into a war against the working class of the city.
So the newspapers who'd been building up this dispute between Macready and Forrest, who'd been selling papers off the back of all of these tensions, they now have to, in some cases, change their tune, and they have to take a position on this incredible outbreak of violence.
But it's remarkable how quickly the elites of the city closed ranks. The mayor, of course, claimed the troops acted in self-defense, although he was hiding in a hotel, so how would he know? But that's what he said. And there were sermons. You might think that the clergy would at least stand up for the victims shot at by your own militia, but they praised the militia for restoring public order by and large. And a lot of editorials in the press echoed that line, saying that they had restored public peace, that it was a regrettable price to pay, but it was necessary. So the elites are saying, well, if you had to kill some working class people in order to restore order, that's the price that we have to pay. And that was kind of the official line.
I think one place where you can see a very different attitude among newspapers is in the British and the Irish newspapers. I was looking at the Find My Past newspaper archive, and the reports in the British newspapers begin on the 29th of May, which shows how long it takes news to cross the Atlantic in the 1840s before the telegraph cables had been laid across the Atlantic. And in Britain, the newspapers like to present this as chaos in America. They like to present this as another reason to criticize America, that things had got so out of control. But it's interesting to read the Irish newspapers and how they reported the riots. The Dublin Evening Post described what happened as the most wanton and unprovoked murderous outrage ever perpetrated in the civilized world. And perhaps speaking to how many of the dead were Irish, their report says that the instigators of that unparalleled crime deserve and shall receive the lasting condemnation of this community, which I think they mean of the Irish people.
That's interesting, isn't it? And that sounds like exactly what they must have been saying. I wonder if the Astor Place riots have lived in infamy among the Irish community. We'll have to get our Irish listeners, let us know.
But it's interesting that the British press pounce upon this as a reason to condemn America. There isn't that division about whether this was right and wrong in the press on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, because the national antagonisms of the moment are real, as we've been saying. And so it's not surprising that the British would take this opportunity to point fingers. But at home, back in New York, the city is trying to reckon with the aftermath. And in the very next night, in fact, thousands gather again in City Hall Park, which is also downtown. And there's a protest which turns furious. And the speakers are demanding justice. They're demanding accountability. Some are demanding vengeance. Of course, they blame the militia. Of course, they blame the Opera House elite. They've blamed them for the whole situation in the first place. A lot of them blame the mayor, who's their political opponent. And in the chaos of that protest, there is a little bit more unintentional violence. In fact, a young boy was killed. So another child was added to the toll of the Astor Place riots. But anger builds with this crowd, and you might be facing, you think, oh my gosh, there's another night of rioting to come. And the crowd starts to move north, up Broadway, back toward Astor Place, and barricades go up, and they're starting to throw stones again, and there are mounted troops, and it looks like we're going to have a replay the very next night. But this time, the authorities move fast. And they absolutely just move in. They break up the crowd. They disperse them without further fatalities before midnight. So their anger is still, seething, but they contain the riot and they stop another one from occurring.
Where are our two actors at this point, Macready and Forrest, the men whose personal rivalry has been at the heart of causing this riot?
Well, Macready has run off. He's left New York. Not surprisingly, anybody in his place, I'm sure, would do the same. He's run off to Boston. And from there, again, in disguise, he boards a ship and sails home for England, never to darken the shores of America again. He goes home and enjoys the twilight years in the comfort of civilized England. Now, Forrest does what you might expect. He issues a statement condemning the violence, but he doesn't condemn the men who caused it. So he basically, threads a needle. He certainly never takes responsibility, and he is never held to any kind of account. His popularity starts to fade at that point, though, as well. His kind of blustering braggadocio seems to have been, kind of quelled at that point. He lost some of that swagger in the aftermath of the carnage that he certainly, was a contributing factor to. There's no doubt about that. There was an official inquiry that followed, but it cleared the militia of any wrongdoing, and everyone agreed that it was the correct response, and the dead were blamed for their own deaths, basically. They were called a mob of ruffians. They were called Irish agitators. They were called dangerous elements. And in this official inquiry, there's very little mention of the peaceful onlookers, of the people who were not a mob of ruffians, who were not agitators or dangerous elements. Women shot through tenement windows, little boys trampled as they flee, but there was no punishment of the police or the military. So shooting civilians in the streets of New York was ruled regrettable but justified.
And the Astor Place Theatre, the building at the center of this riot, the building that had been designed to segregate theatre audiences, what happens to the theatre?
The Opera House survived, but only for a few years. It basically never escaped the blood, literally and metaphorically, on its bricks. And it closed down very shortly afterwards. But the change that it had instigated in theater culture, that lasted. Public theaters across the city responded to the violence by trying to keep the unruly elements out, to try to foreclose such a thing happening again. And so they started raising their ticket prices too. They started restricting access to the gallery, and they started policing the speech inside the theaters more heavily. So this rowdy, accessible, democratic theater that we were talking about last week, it basically begins to close its doors. It doesn't happen overnight, and the Astor Place riot is not the only proximate cause of that, but it was certainly a contributing factor toward the rise of the decorous, polite, quiet, respectable theater that we are familiar with.
Yeah, when we go to the theatre today, I mean, we know what's expected. We know when to applaud. We know when to be quiet. We know how we're supposed to behave. And those traditions was things that our 18th century and early 19th century ancestors would not have recognized at all. So this riot, this largely forgotten riot, is one of the moments towards theatre culture as it exists today. Does it change how Americans think about Shakespeare, the writer at the center of this rivalry and this riot?
Absolutely. What happens here is that we start to see a theater that we would recognize today. Now, most people probably, maybe don't think consciously about theater as being inflected by class today, but it totally is, right? People are very used to thinking, we think of opera as being, an upper class pastime for the elite. Now, there might be loads of working class people who love opera, but its cultural associations are as aristocratic. And the theater itself is seen as a middle class kind of pastime, right? So they're heavily class inflected. And of course, Shakespeare is the most elite theatrical, certainly in English, experience of all. So this is where those lines really start to harden. And this sense that Shakespeare is for the upper classes, is for the elite, it's really crystallizing the separation of high and low culture. And there's a wonderful book about this by the cultural historian Lawrence Levine. And he makes the case that the Astor Place riots really solidify the divisions, not between high class and low class, but high culture and low culture. And of course, Shakespeare is the epitome of high culture today.
So in some ways, this moment that we've largely forgotten about, when Shakespeare was owned by everybody, where people out on the frontiers and out in schoolrooms in the Midwest were learning Shakespeare and reciting Shakespeare. This riot is part of the journey that in some ways takes Shakespeare away from many people and from out of popular culture.
I think journey is the right metaphor, right? As we're saying, it's not an immediate, change, but exactly that we can see the process now accelerating, and you can see in hindsight that this is where things were going.
I think about how theatre is today, and it is elitist, but that space, that quiet that was created, that kind of reverence towards theatre, has been fundamental to theatre and the art of the playwright developing. But as an historian, I look at the way theatres were in Regency England, or New York of the 1840s, or Paris after the Revolution, where there were these raucous spaces. And, we have lost something as well as gained something.
And of course, they were like that in Shakespeare's day too, right? I mean, very much so in the Renaissance.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I mean, the violence was not just on the stage at the Globe. The violence was down there in the pit as well. So it is kind of slightly weird for us to sort of think, as theatres are such quiet, hushed places where you can get kind of kicked out for your cell phone going off, never mind shouting at the stage, to think that they were ever these raucous places, more like a football stadium. It's almost kind of difficult for us to imagine theatre like that.
Theater is such a lightning rod in American history, as we were saying last week. And there's actually a fascinating story about establishing the first theater in Boston because Boston Puritans didn't want it. So part of that Shakespearean trajectory, right, is that the Puritans always want to shut down the theater. They go and they settle Boston. And then Boston is one of the last big cities in America to actually have its own theater because even people like John Hancock think it's British and they don't want a theater because it's associated with the British aristocracy. So there are all of these kinds of really interesting and complicated cultural inflections around the attitudes toward theater and what kinds of behavior is expected at a theater and whether you're for it or against it. I'm sure we will come back to these stories as we go, but there is another really important consequence of the Astor Place riot that people who know New York might be interested in hearing about, which is that it did also transform city politics, not just, cultural politics of the theater. And of course, one of the outcomes, although they said that the militia was justified, it did make clear that there were failures of local policing, that there were failures of infrastructure, that local governance was not doing everything that it needed to do. So even though they kind of, circled the wagons around the aftermath of the riot itself, there was an acknowledgement that they needed to do better. And critics pointed to, the brawling in the street, the fact that there were these street gangs and firefighting companies, rival police forces, they were battling each other, and that all of this needed to be, managed better. And so many elites began to acknowledge that the status quo was not actually tenable, that violence was likely to keep breaking out if they didn't do something about it. They couldn't just keep putting on their kid gloves and assuming that everything would be fine. And so reformers began pushing for various kinds of social reforms. Now, again, this is not solely caused by the Astor Place riot, but it is a contributing factor. And they are pushing for public schools, for free access to higher education, for improved sanitation, so to improve the infrastructure. And one major result of those reforms was the construction of Central Park. And Central Park was planned as a civic space where rich and poor could mix on neutral ground. So it's 843 acres of shared space. So if the theater's not going to be a shared space, you create this large park where you can once again create a space that might allow the rich and poor to mix, that allows everybody to come and enjoy the city. And it's basically intended to civilize an unruly place.
So, Sarah, as I was reading your notes, I was thinking about violence in American theaters. And of course, my mind went to the murder of President Lincoln in 1865, who was murdered by John Wilkes Booth, who was another Shakespearean actor. But what I didn't know was that his father, Junius Brutus Booth, was also in another rivalry with an English actor named Edmund Kean. So before Macready and Forrest, there had been another case where an American Shakespearean actor and an English actor had been at odds with each other, another case in which the press had got excited and built this rivalry up. It didn't end in violence, but it did remind me that this is not a one-off case, and that Shakespeare was kind of central to America finding its voice and trying to distinguish itself from England. This very odd thing that England's greatest playwright became part of America's journey to define itself culturally.
I think that last point that you made is really crucial there, David, is that America was defining itself culturally against Britain. There are these kind of lightning rods where you have to figure out what your relationship to it is. But yes, as you say, the Booths, another very famous acting family. There's a fascinating story there. But of course, another story about violence in the American theater around Shakespeare, Sic Semper Tyrannis, as John Wilkes Booth shouted. We'll tell the story of Lincoln's assassination another day, but that is why the story of the Astor Place riots matters from my point of view, because it isn't really about the stage, because it's about culture, because it's about the crowd, how quickly the crowd turns into a mob, and about how all of that can attract violence. And it's a story about these enduring tensions and divisions in American life. Some of this is a very old story. And we, had the chance with the Astor Place riots to learn that a culture war is a dangerous thing to play around with, that it won't stay metaphorical for long. But that is a lesson that I'm afraid my countrymen and countrywomen continue to have to learn. So we will leave the culture wars there, I think, for today. I'm sure we'll come back to it because it's not going anywhere. And there's plenty of examples in history, as we've been saying. So join us next time on A Journey Through Time.
And thanks for listening.
Bye.